All right, hello, crypto community. Jeff Kerdakis here with Charles Hoskinson, who was the co-founder of Ethereum. He's currently the CEO of IOHK, and he is leading the development, the entire framework of Cardano project. And rumor has it, I just found this out not too long ago, that Charles was actually able to achieve billionaire status by the age 30. So this guy has achieved some incredible things in his life and is continuing to build and innovate. Charles, thanks a lot for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be on, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
So right now, like I mentioned, you have been able to do a lot in the blockchain space, achieve a lot, create some massive innovations. I would envision that this comes with a lot of workload. Yet, you see a lot of your updates on Twitter, and it seems like you're able to achieve a very strong work-life balance. How does that work-life balance play in for you? Like, what are your current hobbies and interests that you enjoy doing?
Yeah, it's actually something they don't teach you when you become an entrepreneur, but you have to develop those skill sets, because if you don't, you just simply burn out and get destroyed. It's very easy to destroy your entire personal life, become an alcoholic, become overweight, and develop lots of health issues when you're in a position where you have just tons of stress every day, unlimited amounts of stress. Then the other side of being an entrepreneur is you have a lot of public criticism in this industry. A reasonable chunk of the space says, when you say Charles Hoskinson, oh, he's a sociopath, he's an evil man, he's a scammer, he's the kind of guy that would go and kick grandma into the swamp and, steal her car for, money. And of course, it's not true, but you hear it over and over again on Twitter, Reddit, Telegram, and in some cases in person when you go to conferences and so forth, where people actually yell at you or accuse you of things. So when you have constant public criticism combined with constant stress and then having to make difficult decisions all the time, the single most important thing is to build a lifestyle that it has a healthy work-life balance and develop good habits, fasting, meditation, exercise daily, a good diet, stay away from vices like alcohol and drugs, these types of things. These are not platitudes, they're necessities to success in this kind of an industry, or else you just destroy yourself. I mean, look at the John McAfees or these other guys. You can kind of see the consequences of letting that fuse run too long and what it does to your psyche and to your physical health.
100%. I think that's the point that a lot of people don't realize, is the emotional impact from, the outside pressures to be able to build a product, the outside pressures on what they expect of you as a person. And I imagine that takes a lot of weathering to kind of toughen yourself up to that.
Yeah, and every mistake you make is forever a mistake, and it becomes you. Like, for example, the "Do you know who I am" tweet. I was in Vietnam, I had the flu, and I just heard that something had been delisted from Chrome, and we were releasing a product literally that week, Icarus, that was a Chrome extension. So I was like, oh my God, 6 months of work, $1 million went into building this thing. Am I now basically in a bad position where all that work is for nothing? So I'm like in a panic trying to reach out to these guys, and they tell me to reach out to a support desk. And I was like, come on, and so I tweet something I probably shouldn't have tweeted. That tweet for 3 years has not only been repeated, that people use it as a character testimony, and they put it on t-shirts, so there's a group of people don't like me, and they just focus on that. And, every other thing I've said and done, there's going to be some upside or downside. And you just have to live with the fact that we live in a society where people judge you by your worst moments, and if they don't like you, and that is forever you. And there's no way you can ever come back from that. You're always that worst moment. You're always that worst communication. So you have to somehow, despite the fact that exists, overcome accepting that in some cases actually limits your opportunities. There's certain markets you can't go into, certain conferences you won't be invited to, certain people you just can't do business with, and even good, well-intended people like VCs or other people, they just write you off because they think you're a particular way because they were told by a friend or something like that. It's really unfortunate, and it's incredibly limiting, but it's the society that we tend to live in today.
I think that's exactly it, especially in cryptocurrency. You see a lot of tribalism where people just pick a side based on a small set of preferences, and then based on that, they'll pick and choose whatever they possibly can to form their own rhetoric of what the reality is. And so especially as you're trying to build something, say like Cardano and moving away from Ethereum, there's so much flack that you get from the outside community just because of potential improvements that you may want to see come into this ecosystem.
Yeah, it's confirmation bias plus. I mean, I started from the perspective that Ethereum as a platform, while revolutionary and quite innovative, doesn't have the oomph necessary, and Ethereum itself acknowledges this, to get us to millions to billions of users. It's why they're building ETH2. And they've been spending years and years and years, and they're basically going to launch a new cryptocurrency to accommodate that. So back in 2015, I said, wow, Ethereum is a great experiment, and they're going to go and have a lot of success. But if we want to get to real impact and use and utility for millions to billions of people, we need to do things a little differently. So we spent 5 years hiring the best scientists, the best engineers, writing paper after paper, following the scientific method, going through the peer review process, writing rigorous code using rigorous formal methods. And all of that was done in the public domain. No patents, no intellectual property, anybody can audit it, and many people did. And despite that we've done all of that, there's always going to be a clique of people saying, this entire work is just a scam. It's an exit scam. It's to just make money. It's to steal from people. It's a vanity vengeance project to attack Vitalik. Even though he's doing the exact same thing as me, he's
right.
Currency because it doesn't work for both, what we're looking for. And that's just the space you live in. And you accept that. And what you do is you say, look, I don't care about those people. At the end of the day, the definition of success is the use and utility of the system. And what we're trying to do is build something that can transform the lives of billions of people. Back in 2014, I did a TED Talk in Bermuda, and I kind of outlined why this technology is so useful for the developing world. And for the past 6 years, consistently, every single day, I go to work and say, these are the people I work for, and this is the point of what we do. And I firmly believe that if we get it right, the system we have will be used for 50 years. Which is why we're using the scientific method and why we're using peer review and why we're using formal methods, because we'd like to get it right up front.
Yes.
Because any mistake we make will be amplified, and something we just, like with the birth of the internet, all the mistakes that Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn made, we now have to live with today. And that's why we have passwords, and that's why we have identity theft and all these horrible things that happen online. It's because of design decisions that they made at the time that they didn't think were very important, but they turned out to be amplified and become problematic. Similarly, what we are trying to build, us and all these other projects like the EOSs and the Tezoses and the F2s, is a financial operating system for billions of people that will one day have a lot to say about your property, your privacy, your data, your identity, your money. And if we get it wrong, then all those mistakes we make will impact your day-to-day life, just like the mistakes of the internet impact your day-to-day life. So 5 years ago, we started a mission to try to do it right. And now we're actually starting to see progress along those lines, and it's super satisfying. It's a bit dismaying that progress gets muted by the trolls and the FUD and the tribalism. But remember, all of that is temporary. Apple had its critics, Microsoft had its critics, Google's had its critics. You don't pay attention to the critics. They don't know what's going on. You just pay attention to your goals and do you have the capacity to execute or not? And one day you wake up and you're Elon Musk with SpaceX. 18 years later, a lot of blown up rockets, and he's the first guy, private company in the world, to launch US astronauts to basically go to the space station. And it just felt like it was easy, right? But we forget all the struggle that they had to go through in those 2 decades.
100%. And I think there's such a catch-22 to what you're explaining in the methodical approach versus just launching, and kind of like the Facebook mentality of go fast and break things. It works in some instances, but as you mentioned, to be able to scale to billions of people on a global financial infrastructure and beyond, it's nice to have it right the first time, even though, as you mentioned, Elon Musk can have a couple rockets that blow up along the way. One thing that I think is probably the most criticized point of Cardano is the speed of that development, because of that internal scientific peer review system. To the people who have those kind of concerns, what's your main point of reassurance? Obviously, Shelley is right on the way, so there's concerns that are being totally mitigated there. But what has been your overall perception as people have been putting pressure to deliver a product, whereas I feel like in your instance you've been a little bit more predisposed to do it methodically?
Right. So you have to pay a price, and you either pay it on the head or the tail. And what we chose to do is pay it on the head. And that meant that we had a much slower time out the gate than a lot of our competitors. But now we have a much easier tail ahead of us. And what happened with Ethereum and all these other projects is they chose to push those costs out to the tail. And the problem is the tail, the people who suffer from that are not the project founders. It's the project users. So when the software doesn't work, they're the ones who lose the money. and they're the ones whose dApps break. And those end users get a very poor, bad taste in their mouth. And they say, well, this is not fair. The guys who created this thing became really rich, millions of dollars to billions of dollars. And then when it blows up in my face, I'm the guy who has to pay for it. So I felt it was immoral to amortize that cost to the user base. We had to make sure that when we created something, at least some of the foundations were laid in such a way that it has a low cost, low probability of failure for the event. Same for SpaceX. When they built their rockets, it's like you could certainly get rockets to space faster, but then the people who would pay the price if they don't work are the astronauts on them. And that's not obviously not something you want to entertain, right? So they had to do all this work up front to prove that the systems work to get to that tail. And now that they're there, they enjoy huge built-in advantages over their competition. In their case, it's low launch cost. So in our case, the fact that we have done the science means that the entire academic world is basically building on top of what we've come up with, not our competitors. So you see, when you write 70 papers or 100 papers or however many papers it ends up for the Cardano project, and those papers survive peer review, then all the scientists say that's the legitimate pile of research that I should do my derivative work on. We're already seeing this, like with Nakamoto proof of stake out of University of Illinois and Stanford. We had nothing to do with that paper, but yet independent people out of Stanford and UIUC and other top tier computer science schools decided to use as a foundation the work that we started to go write a derivative work that now benefits our ecosystem. So what we've done is we've created a giant decentralized brain that's going to keep paying year after year after year and keep scaling year after year with more graduate students, postdocs, and scientists. So there's going to be a great acceleration in the science and a great flowering of the science, which gives us many different approaches, whether we want to use snarks with privacy or go in a sharding approach. All those things are now available to us as a consequence of doing our homework and doing it right the first time. Second, by having a really nice ledger model, a really nice accounting model, a really nice smart contract model, there's a much easier path to getting normal developers into our ecosystem, whether they be a Java developer, a .NET developer, a JavaScript developer, and treating the blockchain not as a completely alternative ecosystem where you have to completely rewrite everything from scratch, but rather treating it like a service. And as an app developer, that's something that you're much more used to. You say, oh, I want to do something with Twitter. I'll just use their APIs and wire it into my application, but you still have your Node app or you still have your cell phone app. And you're just now adding capabilities from a third-party service provider. Well, the way that we design Cardano is that's really easy to do, and you can keep your old code and then wire it into our system as a service provider. So we think we have a significantly better operating model and development model where you can write very high assurance code as an app developer and get a lot of certainty that those rough edges are gone. So it's a significantly better development platform. So yeah, you have to pay a lot of head cost for that to do things the right way. Like writing a programming language is not an easy thing to do. The team that we brought together to do that has 30 years of legacy in the computer science world of designing programming languages. They created Haskell, they worked on Go, Java, a whole bunch of different languages throughout their career. So they have a lot of experience of what does it take to build a real programming language. And what does it take to build a great ecosystem around a programming language that has great tooling, support, and actually has been used in enterprise-grade applications and consumer applications that we use every single day. But to get that team set up, incentivize that team, get them to think about the problems we have, it takes years to get that started. It's a huge head cost. But once that team's built, then they tell all their friends, and they tell all their friends, and then suddenly you have this huge network effect, and you have all these great people waking up every day who say it's safe to do research here, it's safe to do development here, and you inherit a beautiful ecosystem there of great developers. It's the same when you talk about consensus for Ouroboros. I mean, the Casper guys were following this move fast and break things ideology, and they kept having regressions. They built a protocol and it worked until it didn't. It worked until it didn't. And they kept having version after version. Then the team forked and Vlad went his own way and Vitalik went another way. And it took them just as much time to get to a point where they have a design for Casper. And I'd argue their model has much more trade-offs and is not quite as good as the model that we have. And not only is our model better, it's much easier to extend our model when we don't have to shard to get high performance, which means we can have a much higher threshold for security. And it's easier to layer things like trusted hardware or a stake pool model or other things into our system. And we have all these beautiful papers that kind of explain the theory in depth. Like all the economic theory was done out of Oxford with a top game theorist. And that's a whole realm of research that we've been able to kind of wire in very gracefully and keep adding to it over time. And it's very easy to set all the system parameters to have the system converge to where we think. And we have months of validation with our ITN for that. So it seems like it's too big of a price to pay. But then it's like saying, hey guys, it's early days internet, and we don't even have, you know, a proper web browser yet. And you're now saying we have to solve this whole problem in 24 months. And if we don't solve it now, then you're going to lose your momentum and your network effect. Look, every 3 years, the top 10 in coin market cap rotate out. And all the projects we think are going to win, are going to be big and have captured all the network effect, have been replaced. I'm old enough to remember Peercoin. I remember NXT. I remember all these projects that came and go, and they all had great reasons why they should be successful and why they should be dominant. And for their time, they had a great network effect. And then suddenly it all disappeared. In the big technology industry, it wasn't too long ago that MySpace had 100 million users and Facebook was the small platform. It wasn't too long ago that Netscape was the #1 browser. It wasn't too long ago that Yahoo was the #1 search engine. You know, it wasn't too long ago and 95% of all applications written were written for Windows. Now many app developers don't even write for Windows. They write iOS first or Android first. So things can change very quickly, especially with network effects when you have strong competitive pressures and a lot of consumer interest here. And in our space, we've noticed a trend for that to change out within 2 or 3 years. So it's less about how do you chase the network effect of today, and it's more about how do you get to a point where the experiences are useful and provide real utility to millions to billions of people. And it can gradually fit into things that have much larger network effects, whether that be the browser or .NET or Java or these things or incumbent applications, and you provide real value for them. If you have that approach, you'll win. Even if you don't win completely, you'll win at a scale of millions of users, which translates to a huge platform, considerably larger than even Bitcoin today.
100%. And, you know, I don't necessarily buy into the ideology that it's only going to be one protocol forever. I believe that we're going to have a massive diversification across a spectrum. And so that said, you know, as a, let's say a dApp developer is coming in, they're looking to build on a system. You mentioned network effect. I feel Ethereum right now has that mass network effect. A lot of dApps currently built on it. How does Cardano plan to not necessarily overthrow, as mentioned, you know, I believe there's a diversification happening, but convince dApp developers to build on Cardano? You know, you mentioned there's some benefits in comparison to sharding and the way that people can plug in. Can you add a little bit more color, particularly for a layman?
Well, first off, there's 2 Ethereums. There's ETH1 and ETH2.
Right. Yeah.
I'm very skeptical that ETH1 will just magically go away the minute that they go to ETH2, because there's $26 billion worth of miners on ETH1. And basically what you're telling all of them is you have to shut off and you're now all out of business and you're being replaced with a different consensus model. What if those miners don't comply and they run the old system? Then you basically have these 2 systems living in parallel. And I think there's a lot of internal discussion about that, which is why they're pushing for ProgPow and other such things. But it's not a clean transition. Second, if you actually ask about what's been accomplished on Ethereum in terms of DeFi and applications, none of these applications have gotten to a large-scale network effect. There's no Farmville. You know, right. There's nothing in that platform that says there's 100 million users and it's the standard and it's the place to be. It's basically just a sandbox to experiment with a totally different model. And the vast majority of dApps are dead dApps. They don't really do anything. They're no longer used. They have no network effect. And there's a few AppCoin projects that are quite prominent. But then those AppCoins have to ask themselves, why is it that they treat Ethereum as special and different? Why don't they become multi-chain? Tether's multi-chain. There's so many things that are becoming multi-chain. So those dApps look at infrastructure just like infrastructure. You know, you have hosts. Sometimes you host on DigitalOcean. Sometimes you host on Rackspace. Sometimes you host on Amazon. So that vendor lock-in of Ethereum being the end-all be-all is diminishing. And many people are pushing to have a multi-chain model. Even efforts from Consensus itself is looking into a multi-chain model. And certainly Polkadot and, you know, Parity Tech is pushing in this direction as well. So, you know, that's the first thing is you don't really have to overcome the network effect. You just have to make a compelling argument that it makes sense for them to deploy infrastructure on your chain in addition to other chains. That's one dimension of it. Second, you have to ask yourself, well, hang on, if no one's achieved a large-scale network effect yet, how do I attract the developers to get a large-scale network effect? And we have a model for that already. 2007, the iPhone came out, and at that time they had 0 developers. that was a completely new model for applications. And what was exciting about it was that you could do new things with that platform that you couldn't do with other platforms. So it attracted a lot of very sophisticated developers incentivized by the iFund, which was done by Kleiner Perkins and Apple together, to basically go and build that cohort of experiences. And that created a huge adoption of that platform by retail clients. And because that platform had high adoption, more developers came in chasing those retail clients. So that's the model to look for. You know, how do you overcome a gargantuan monopoly? In this case, it was Windows with billions of users, and they had 0 apps on the iPhone, yet they completely inverted it within just a decade, which was an extraordinary accomplishment. So that's the model to study there. And, you know, I think we have a very natural analogy. You know, we're planning on doing a dedicated fund since similar to what the iFund accomplished. So we can bring in that first wave of great people. There's unique things to the Cardano platform that give great experiences that are difficult to achieve with other platforms, just like the iPhone had to Windows. And then the other thing is, because we have a very sophisticated language design, we can inherit all these wonderful Haskell developers and functional programmers who right now don't write apps in the cryptocurrency space because they can't. Solidity is an imperative model. So we basically have access to some of the smartest, best financial programmers in the world who, for the first time ever, can use their native code that they've been writing for 20 plus years in our ecosystem to go build some great experiences. And then, you know, you look for some kind of launch stuff, like some good DeFi. So you go for the oracles and the stable coins and these things. You bring some innovation in those models, just like Apple did with Google Maps and these other things, to really showcase what the platform can do. But then that brings your first wave of customers in. And because they exist, more people will come in to chase that. Some will come in as a multi-chain play, and you have to have a solution for that. And some will come in with a mono-chain play as completely new developers, and we have a play for that too. So it's a bit complicated, but you know, if you're a student of history, you can definitely do it, and it's been done multiple times through multiple platforms for getting developers. But I think the biggest lie told in our space has been that Ethereum's already won, and that somehow everybody just has to catch up with that. Honestly, it's like saying, hey, you're the biggest fish in a small pond next to the ocean, as I mentioned in the Sari interview. It's like, yes, you're a big fish, but the ocean's a lot bigger than you. And you're arguing over how we should go and try to take some food away from this big fish in this small pond. I'm saying I'd like to go live in the ocean. So how do I get into the ocean? And right now, nobody's built a bridge there yet. And the fact that a lot of this infrastructure is going to have to be redone, the development model's probably going to be redone. It's probably going to be moved to WASM or something like that. And all the languages are being redone. All the tooling is being redone. It's very early days. And there's no permeance to any of this stuff. And the fact that none of these DeFi apps work at a large scale, and they work until they break, like, for example, MakerDAO, these are just good indications of how early days it is for everybody. And you can switch out a network effect very quickly when it's early days.
100% agreed there. Yeah, right now DeFi is definitely the most predominant mover in the crypto space as of right now, and particularly on Ethereum. When you're looking at, you know, the rollout of Cardano over the next year, 5 years, 10 years, what do you look into the future and think, okay, these are the big grandiose visions that I hold and that I'm really personally excited to see unfold?
Yeah, so first we have to get the decentralized brain right, and we're almost there, because that guarantees that there's no founder effect. You don't need a Vitalik or a Dan Larimer or a Charles Hoskinson to kind of dream up and imagine these great protocols. You know that for the rest of time, there's going to be an endless resource of brilliant professors and graduate students and postdocs who are writing papers in your ecosystem to give you competitive advantages in whatever technology class you want to play in, whether that be game theoretic and incentives design, programming language theory, distributed systems, new forms of cryptography like multi-party computation or zero knowledge. All that stuff, you have competitiveness at par or exceeding the marketplace. And we're almost done with that. So that's moving in a very fast pace in a nice direction. Second, you need to have a replenishing funding source and decision engine. This is something that Ethereum's completely ignored and is existential. So projects like Tezos and Dash focus on this, very wisely so. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to solve the who pays and who decides problem. And if you don't, then you end up implicitly centralizing the project along the lines of a small group of custodians. So while you're decentralized, you, out of necessity, need a small group of people to stick around for a long period of time, be decision makers for that system. So you need the Vitaliks or the Dans or the Brendans to basically give you some good answers. So if you have a good governance system, you can completely ameliorate that, and then you get some certainty that there will always be money. there will always be a treasury around to explore new things and to develop and keep people in, whether at the VC level for dApps that they want to port over, all the way to the infrastructure level to bring in privacy or whatever capabilities the system has. So we're turning on those governance features very soon, and we're going to rapidly evolve them. And I believe they'll be best in class in industry. And this is an area, because of Vitalik, that Ethereum has decided to completely punt on. He's written very dismissively about blockchain-based governance or on-chain governance and said, oh, it's not a priority. And Bitcoin has also decided to completely pass on this. So the third generation cryptocurrencies have these capabilities, and I think they're a huge competitive advantage because they give a lot of certainty and they allow you to converge to making controversial and difficult decisions without having an Ethereum Classic or a Bitcoin Cash or these types of events, which really damage your ecosystem and slow you down. And then finally, you have to have the ability to enable experiences that people haven't had before. This is why iPhone was so powerful, and this is why Android was so powerful. It wasn't just it's a new computer to use and it's a smaller screen. It's a new computer that you can use in ways you've never used a computer before. You see, so you always need to be chasing those new experiences in the space and those customers who need those new experiences. So this is one of the reasons why we have such strong presence in Africa. I've been in Africa for years. There are millions of customers there who are in the market for identity systems, voting systems. They're in the market for a completely new way of doing property rights, new way of doing voter registration. They're in the market for new ways of doing financial products, in some cases securitizing their companies, and they have no options other than crypto. The banks aren't coming there, Wall Street's not coming there, and their local governments aren't innovative enough to bring these solutions to them. So they actually have the ability to just pick an independent transnational standard. And we've seen this with M-Pesa. We've seen this with all kinds of cool little innovations that have happened there. And globalization is forcing them to upgrade, or else they lose market access. Because when Starbucks says stuff like, hey, we're only going to buy coffee if you can prove certain things about it, if you can't prove those things about the coffee you grow, you can't sell to Starbucks, which means you lose huge, huge revenue potential. So it's an imperative that they upgrade to new systems. And if we have to be there to be that upgrade path, we bring new experiences, use, and utility not only to them, but to the world. Automated compliance, significantly faster transactions and settlement. We bring completely new ways of creating securities and trading securities, new ways of doing identity, new ways of voting, much more sophisticated than voting in the West. And these are just new things that they've never seen before, and they can be rapidly evolved, and they can be given on a scale of millions of customers. And if those customers get digitized, they build wealth, and then the rest of the world will say, how do we get some of that pie? So they become interoperable with that standard, and then suddenly that's how you get Chase to upgrade, and that's how you get the Western world to upgrade and have favorable regulation, not because they're being nice about it, but because they want 5 million new customers, 10 million new customers who have a lot of money. No newspaper in the world ever wanted to go online. They had to, or else they basically go out of business. And so it's the same situation here. You don't ask for permission. You create an economic reality where they have to do this to stay competitive. And you do that by getting the developing world online, and you give them new use and utility that they've never seen before. And so if your platform can enable that, then you basically get an iPhone situation. And that's what we're chasing. We don't really care too much about how do we beat the Tezoses and the EOSes or the Ethereums. But we think to win the game, you have to change the rules of the game and play a different game. And that's what we're focused on.
And that is the reason why I got into crypto in the first place. I think the entire spiel there is absolutely beautiful in what we're going to be able to bring to the world in terms of innovation, heightened transparency, new regulations, the ability for just everything to be so crisp, clean, clear.
Right. And just a basic human concept of fairness.
Yeah. Yes.
This idea that the richest person in the world has the same market as the poorest person in the world. That's never been the case in the history of humanity. The wealthy and powerful, the well-connected, the privileged, they've always played by a different set of rules than the weakest amongst us. And the whole point about cryptocurrency, blockchain technology, is it's a great equalizer. It doesn't know who you are. It doesn't care who you are. There is no special line. There is no back door. Everybody uses the front door, and everybody actually uses the same system and the same infrastructure. And the fact that we're able to do this in a way that gives you a better market and a better system than the richest person in the world has is pretty extraordinary. It's a rare opportunity in human history. You give nothing up to leapfrog in. And I think the first adopters are those who have no preferences. And so you go with the developing world. And that's where we've been focused extensively. That said, it's equally useful for the developed world. We have a lot of enterprise plays that we do. We do a lot of things on the GovTech side, like with the government of Georgia, for example, the country. And we're in Mongolia as well. So there's a lot of cool places where we can sell at the highest levels and at the lowest levels. And I think what we've constructed with Cardano is a way to evolve into a financial operating system that's useful for billions of people over time.
Definitely. And something that I find very interesting is the governance feature that you had touched on a little bit earlier, because, as these protocols, these systems grow larger, monolithic, the tacky phrase, with great power comes great responsibility. I think that's even like a Spider-Man thing. And putting in governance, I feel like there's almost like a spectrum, and maybe this is a little bit overgeneralized, but it's either one person, one vote, or it's an oligarchy, or somewhere in between. And how does Cardano, how are you anticipating to position yourself so that governance can be fair, equal, but also in the same breath that the people who are educated are the ones that have the most influence on the decisions?
Yeah, that's a super hard question. So this is where you leave the comfort of certainty and you enter into the trailblazing world of experimentation. So we have certainty on the science and on the engineering side. Math-based software, these techniques have been around for 40 years, and that's why rockets work. So we know how to do that, and that's like check the box. And then scientific method's been around for 400 years, and that's why we have modern medicine and rockets and all these other magical things. There's a lot of certainty there, so check that box there. But then when you look at governance, you say, well, where has the perfect government ever been? There's over 190 countries. Is there an example of a government that does everything well? Even if you make decisions well with one collection of situations, a different situation could actually be really bad. Like cryptocurrencies, for example, are super good at staying resilient in the face of really bad events. So you can have plagues breaking out, you can have all kinds of governments collapsing, wars, and Bitcoin is going to operate exactly the same way the next day than it did the day before. So coronavirus has no effect on Bitcoin, for example, right? But then where cryptocurrencies are really bad is when you actually want to make decisions quickly, change quickly, respond to a crisis quickly. That coordination on that scale is extremely difficult. So every tool basically has a trade-off associated with it. And then you ask a question about egalitarianism. So as Americans, we tend to like this concept of everybody's equal, everybody's vote is equal. But even amongst that, there's kind of a notion of power structures. So people are better informed, they're wealthier, more educated. And those people tend to exert more influence over a system than people who are less informed, less educated, or have less incentives to participate. Just your personal circumstances can have a huge impact. If you tend to work, a minimum wage job and you're living paycheck to paycheck, you don't really have a lot of time to worry about the philosophies of whether we should have an aggressive foreign policy or a humble foreign policy, and how America is going to work its way through globalization and compete with China up until 2050. This is a very academic foreign policy debate, right? You're more worried like, am I going to be able to make rent? Meanwhile, when you're a billionaire or a millionaire and you have no day job and you're just kind of like sitting at home thinking about stuff, you have the ability to get really deep into that. And there's no coincidence that the founding fathers of the United States were all aristocrats. They were really well educated because they had parents who could pay for a great education. So they were able to understand what happened in Greece and in Rome, and the death of the Roman Republic and how it got taken over by a dictatorship, or why the Magna Carta existed. They'd actually read it. They were tremendously literate people. So when they were talking about how to build an ideal government, they were drawing upon decades of education, personal experience, and so forth, whereas a different class couldn't participate. So we like to think, well, that's not fair, but that's just how life has been. And if it's harnessed correctly, you get a constitution and a declaration of independence and these beautiful founding documents. When it's harnessed incorrectly, you get this exclusive ivory tower that dehumanizes people who don't happen to belong into the aristocracy. And you have this very vertical hive city class stratification that's dystopian. So you have to be very careful with the way that you design the system. So I think probably for a cryptocurrency, you have to break it along certain lines. First off, you have to have a mechanism that allows you to decide priorities in the system. Funding priorities and evolutionary priorities. Okay, that's the first step. And there's already a voting system that allows you to do this. It's called preference voting. So you say, I have a finite resource, and the ask is greater than the finite resource. So I have to somehow winnow down the set of things that are being asked for to match that finite resource. So perhaps it's money, for example, or development hours, okay? So you have 1 million development hours of ask and only 10,000 development hours of development time for the year, for example. So you first have to pick your preferences. So you look at that and say, of all the things that are being asked for, what are the ones that are the highest priority to me? That's number choice 1. Second highest, third highest. You get something like a board account or a cadre system to actually converge as a collective whole into a set of priorities that match your available resource. Then you ask stage 2, of the things that are being asked for, which ones should actually get funded or should actually get development time. And that could be a threshold vote. Okay, so you need different voting systems based upon what you're trying to optimize around. Then there's this question of, well, hang on, who gets to participate? You have kind of an expert class, and that has nothing to do with whether you have money or not. Andreas Antonopoulos is an expert in the Bitcoin space, but he's nowhere near Roger Ver's wealth or Adam Back's wealth or any of these other people. He didn't really benefit too much from the appreciation of Bitcoin because he didn't have the personal circumstances to hold on to it. So he's poor relative to the big guys in the space, but he has huge influence because he wrote Mastering Bitcoin and he has all these videos he's done. And a lot of people look to him as one of the trusted voices in the space. So you can build an expert class up, and because you have a blockchain-based treasury system, you actually can pay them to be experts inside the system. And they can work and sway public opinion one way or the other. They also, in some cases, you can delegate voting power to those experts, and then they can basically vote for large pools of capital in the system or a lot of influence in the system, despite the fact that they personally don't control it. Furthermore, they can work in what's called innovation management. So when I come up with an idea, I have a whole company around me. So I have a raw, unstructured idea, and I give it to my people, and they do a lot of stuff to it. And by the time the public hears about it, hopefully it's a much better idea than when I started, because there's been all this iteration. That's innovation management. So similarly, when somebody in the community comes up with an idea, it may be a great idea, but in a raw form, it may not be able to get traction because it's missing a lot. So in addition to having an expert class form in your system, you also need to have some facility in your system to help people evolve and improve and iterate their ideas, or blend ideas together, merge ideas together. So this is a concept of idea flow, innovation management, so forth. And that's another provision in the system that you need to have. So if you have good ballot structure, you have the way to vote on priorities and vote on what gets funding and development resources. You have funding available to fund experts in an expert class to be endowed inside your system, and you have good innovation management. These components together actually will probably give you a very good outcome, all things considered, assuming you have some curation in the beginning. And then what happens is, as you iterate the system and iterate the system and iterate, you need less and less curation, and eventually get to a point where the system gets fully decentralized. And it's the same for the American Republic. You know, when we first started, George Washington basically defined what being a president was like. How many terms the president gets to have, how the president should be addressed, what the president should do. Washington had to sit down with his friends and say, well, what's the best way of doing this? And then that became a convention. And in some cases, that convention got codified in law. Like when presidents started running more than 2 terms, we passed a constitutional amendment to restrict them from ever doing that again, like in the case of FDR. So similarly, you have to do that with curation when you first start the system, is you kind of demonstrate how to propose a ballot, how to allocate developer resources, how to do an improvement proposal process. And then people kind of learn and they get used to that. And they say, okay, that's the way we should do things. And then even if you leave, the system will still operate in that steady state and become resilient against changes to that particular state. And then there's a question of, how do you know it's working? Well, are you able to make decisions? Are you able to converge to a proper decision? Are you able to fund projects that ought to get funded? And is the project growing? So you just create metrics, KPIs, and then you say, every year, are we getting more people or are we losing people? Every year, are we getting more technological capabilities and evolving faster than the year before? And if that's the case, that's an indication that your governance system is stable and it's functional. If you can't converge, if you always have controversy, everybody always hates each other, that's an indication your system is not working well. Like, look at the US election system, 9% approval rating for the Congress. So obviously no one's happy with that branch of government. Everybody hates each other on the executive side. It's like Trump, Biden, it's just pure hate on both sides. And it's not even like, I disagree with you, it's you should be in jail. And so obviously that's not working so well. And nobody even believes in the legitimacy of the office. Whenever their side loses, they say the other side didn't actually win the election. That's not fair. So there's no confidence in there, and nobody likes the choices that they have in the system. They say, why is it Trump Biden? We should have had different choices. So no one's happy there. So these are all indicators that the system is broken and it's not working correctly. So you can draw analogies between real life systems like that and cryptocurrency systems. Like look at Bitcoin Cash. People felt that the process that was followed was so unfair that they were willing to create their own cryptocurrency, fork off and do Bitcoin Cash, and say this is the real Bitcoin. The other Bitcoin has become irredeemable and basically corrupted beyond repair. And great people left the system. So wherever you sit on that debate, it's very clear there was a governance failure in that particular debate, and that the governance system of Bitcoin was not capable of handling that event, or otherwise they would have been able to come to a reasonable compromise. Everybody would have stayed together and Bitcoin Cash would have never come to exist. So, you kind of just set your goalposts that way, and they evolve over time as the system grows in capability, utility, and so forth. And eventually they become resilient against outside attack, including from attacks from the founders.
Mm-hmm. I know I'm really excited to see the rollout, because I find that you clearly have such a strong mathematical and a logical view of human psyche and governance, which is such a malleable thing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that happens, and how, when you look at Bitcoin Cash, it seemed like the network became so big that eventually you get these fringe ideologies, and, one person can spawn a movement in the direction of another ideology. And so it just, like, to me, it seems like it's almost an inevitability of forks happening.
Bitcoin Cash was not a fringe ideology. It was born out of intellectual dishonesty from the Bitcoin core developers in a very particular way. It wasn't about block size. It was about inclusive accountability. And this is the thing that most people missed because they weren't technical enough. So the problem with Bitcoin, and every single cryptocurrency currently suffers this problem. People are trying to resolve it, like Halo is trying to resolve it and these things. But here's the issue. We have this built-in concept in cryptocurrencies that everybody checks each other's homework. It's called inclusive accountability. So when you send me a transaction, I don't believe you. I have a full node. I'm able to verify that that's real tokens and they haven't been double spent. Great. I'm only able to do that because I have all of history. And so you have a replicated system, but it's like a bacteria colony. If it gets too big, it poisons itself. So similarly, what happens when your blockchain's a petabyte in size? What happens when it's an exabyte in size? No one can actually check the homework anymore. So you lose the property of inclusive accountability, and you have hyper-centralization around a small group of custodians in the system. So the Bitcoin core developers don't have a good solution to this yet. So they're saying, hey, keep the block size really small so we don't get to that threshold until much later in the future. And we'll kick everything off the chain through Lightning or these other things until then. And then at some point, we'll figure it out. The big blockers are basically saying, let's go fight that straight on and come up with it sooner. And by the way, you cannot be cash, you cannot be a money system if you're using a centralized or federated layer 2 solution. You see, so that's the problem with a lot of these debates, is that sometimes you're not even debating the core issue. There's this implicit understanding that's beneath the surface, and people don't want to mention that because it's compromising to the system as a whole. So you actually end up arguing over symptoms instead of the root cause or the root disease. And we still haven't resolved this problem. Good governance systems are crucibles of truth. They get to the root cause, and they actually ask, why are people so angry with each other? In America, we have this Black Lives Matter issue right now. And the symptom at the top is that the police are causing all kinds of havoc and chicanery on certain groups of people. But the root cause is much deeper. A lot of the people in this movement really actually want to institute radical institutional change to the United States. They think that capitalism is fundamentally unfair to certain groups of people. And as a consequence, it needs to be replaced with a different system. But that's not the tagline. They're talking about something a little bit higher up, because that's very popular. Yes, it's very bad when you see a government oppressing or abusing its people. We saw this in apartheid. We saw this all throughout many governments in the past, and it's always immoral and wrong. But then when you actually start getting deeper and deeper and deeper, you realize there's huge divisions then of what's the solution to this? How do you resolve these institutional problems and so forth? Good governance systems allow you to have that conversation without chaos and without people throwing Molotov cocktails at each other. Bad governance solutions, what they do is they empower somebody to silence all opposition and then basically converge to a single philosophy. That's the problem with a lot of these things. They say, oh, I'm legitimate now because I got voted into power. So anybody who opposes me is illegitimate and basically gets silenced. And I don't care that they have a difference of opinion. My opinion is the only one that matters. And then everybody who voted for that person says, well, hang on a second here. I didn't exactly sign up for this. Like the vast majority of people who voted for Hitler and Hindenburg back in the 1930s, they were just really deeply frustrated that Germany got shafted at the end of World War I, and they'd experienced hyperinflation and all these other things. And there was like some communist stuff over here and some race stuff over here, but they didn't particularly care about those things. They were much more concerned with the fact that their money was worthless. And they were much more concerned with the fact that society was very unstable, and they felt that the national pride of their country had been badly damaged, which is why they actually voted in an 80-year-old heroic general to basically be their leader, because they said, oh, this guy will restore, he's the next Bismarck, he'll restore our dignity. And I guess there's this Hitler guy over here, but who cares? He's vice chancellor. And then once he got into power, he said, well, I've been democratically elected. I now have the mandate. I'm going to go do my whole thing. And everybody's like, wait a minute, we didn't exactly sign up for this, but then it's too late, right? He has the mandate and the power and legitimacy. It's an example of a poor governing structure. It enables these things. It was the same for Cuba's revolution. You had a very bad dictator, and then this Castro guy comes in and he says, I'm going to free everything up. Me and Che got it all figured out. And then he gets into power and he's like, yeah, we're going to do like more than we said. They're like, well, hang on a second. We didn't exactly sign up for this. Well, okay, well, the gulag is always available for you, and you get gulagged, right? So we see these things occur. So my point about that is that with cryptocurrencies, we must be careful to understand the past and understand that just because a governance system exists doesn't give you unlimited legitimacy behind the decisions that the system makes. It's only as good as its ability to get the bedrock to the crucible of the matter and then allow divergent opinions to, without fear of attack or silencing or censorship, have those legitimate divergent opinions, and eventually for the system to come up with a compromise and be able to pull all the threads together and get through. Even in the United States, we failed with this. Many countries overcame the evils of slavery through economic means. What they did is they phased it out slowly. They basically said, okay, you can't buy anymore, you can't import anymore, and we'll gradually buy out the slaves and set them free. Okay, we didn't have a governing system that could accommodate that, so the only solution was a civil war and a horrible, situation, killed 500,000 people. So, different approaches, they achieved the same outcome, but one was much better, and the other one left to 100 years of really bad situations because of that governance failure. So we have to learn from those situations and apply those same improvements and techniques to our system to get around these things. And every now and then, unfortunately, you're going to have a failure, and then a majority will rule. And that's a learning experience too. And if we get it wrong, it will result in a fork, and there will be a Cardano Classic or a Cardano Cash or something else in the marketplace. And we'll do our best to try to resolve that where and when it comes up.
Gotcha. So pivoting back a little bit more to what's currently happening with Cardano, obviously Shelley is coming out in the next week or so.
Yep.
Can you add a little bit of color to exactly what that means in the ecosystem, what changes people can expect to see, and what's going to be rolling out?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So we are moving from a static and federated system like Ripple to a dynamic and decentralized system like Bitcoin or Ethereum. And that's a huge transition. When you're already a live cryptocurrency, it's a lot easier to do when you're an ERC20 token, because you just do what EOS did, move to a different distribution on a new network. But when you're moving from a live network, you have to change the tires on a car while it's driving. So we spent over a year trying to figure out how to do that. And we came up with a beautiful way of doing it. And next week is the beginning of the execution of that plan. Well, I should say the finalization of the execution of that plan. We've been working at it since December with the ITN and then the SPO, testnets, and so forth. But on July 29th, we're forking Cardano. And at that point, stake pools get to turn on and start making blocks. So instead of a federated group of people making blocks, the stake pools are making blocks. And basically, Cardano will be totally in the hands in just a few months as the system gets more decentralized over time to basically the stake pool operators, and will be dozens of times more decentralized than Bitcoin right out of the gate. And then over time, it'll evolve to probably 100 times more decentralized than Bitcoin, which is truly an achievement, and running on just 10 kilowatts of power, which is like, a house. It's not a substantial amount. It was much better performance and much faster settlement time. So it's the realization of 5 years of research in protocol design, many, many millions of dollars, over $100 million total of engineering effort that we've spent in the last 5 years. And it opens up rapidly getting smart contracts, rapidly getting governance, rapidly getting all these other capabilities that we've been working on for 5 years, and being able to then bring that to the space and see real use and utility come into the platform. And then we'll be as much defined as Ethereum is by our users than by our Genesis work. You know, when we think of Ethereum, we tend to think of Ethereum in terms of MakerDAO and, you know, all these other projects that are on it. And similarly, this is now the beginning of where people think of Cardano as much by our stake pool operators and much by our dApps and other things and tokens that are issued on the system, rather than just the core protocols running the system. They'll kind of fade into the backdrop. And we're having a great event to kind of put the flag in the ground, the Cardano Summit, which is July 2nd to 3rd. If you go to cardanosummit.iohk.io, you can register for free. I think over 6,000 people have registered so far for it. We have 100 plus speakers. Stephen Wolfram is going to be there. Vint Cerf is going to be there, the father of the internet. So it's going to be a great event. And we'll talk about everything from governance to regulation to, you know, what does it mean to have a cryptocurrency, to like deep technical details like our native asset standards, so how to issue an asset on Cardano, to how our smart contract model works and how to write dApps on Cardano, to how to be a stake pool operator and what do we learn from the last 6 months of running the ITN and so forth. So it's kind of a one-of-a-kind event, and it's all online, free to attend, and we would love to see as many people as possible go there.
Right on. Perfect. I know your time is short. You have a meeting coming right up. So I think that's a great kind of segue for people to go check out the event. Anywhere else that you want people to kind of go check out, integrate with, or funnel right to that event? I
mean, subscribe to all of our social accounts, you know, the IOHK YouTube account and my Twitter and the YouTube channel that we have for IOHK videos, and our blog. If you go to iohk.io, you can find our blog. There's a lot of great information. And actually, the Cardano website's being redone. I think tomorrow or on the 1st, it's going to be released. So if you go to cardano.org, we have a completely refreshed website for the project that McCann built with our people. And it's just beautiful website, very information rich, a lot of great things there that lead all core founders of the project and things that we're working on. So yeah, cardano.org, iohk.io, and all our social accounts in addition to the summit. Definitely great to subscribe to, and tons of information comes out on a pretty much weekly basis.
Right on. Perfect. All right. Well, anyone listening, you guys know what to do. Charles, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate the time.
That's a lot of fun. Thank you so much, Jeff.
All right. And for everyone who's tuning in, see you guys next time.